So hello. Thanks, John, for inviting me, and I'd like to thank the rest of the Royal Mitchell History Conference on inviting me here today. As John mentioned, my name is Steve Pop. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Ecological Services Division with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're co-located with the Refuge Division in Shirley. I'm one of two senior biologists in the office. Steve Sienkiewicz is in the audience here. We're aging in place there at the office. We cover all of Long Island, New York, and Rockland, Westchester counties with a variety of issues, including endangered species recovery, conservation, conservation planning assistance projects, which are basically federal projects with other federal agencies like the Corps of Engineers, HUD, FEMA, National Park Service, and so on. I'd like to say, John, you have quite the turnout here. I think next time you have to have Jay-Z sponsor the event. We could do it at the Barclays Center or something. So anyway, I'm here to talk about the first half of Saltmarsh Sparrow. See, we have a picture here from the foreground here is the background. The foreground is a studio shot, something online, excuse me. This other shot in the background is Saltmarsh Sparrow at Pine Neck Marsh in Quogue. It was a TNC property, and we were, a few years ago, just starting to develop some survey protocols for other species. Here you've got a close-up of a Saltmarsh Sparrow. They're about 13.5 centimeters in length, a well-marked long-billed sparrow, colorful orange, black and gray head pattern, gray crown and nape and white streaks on the back. Found throughout our salt marshes all around. There's a closely related sparrow, the Nelson sparrow on the left. See, compared to the salt marsh sparrow on the right, salt marsh has the distinctive coloring around the malar region here, and along with the orange, black, and gray markings on its head, streaked flanks and breast, compared to the Nelsons, which has more of a white, definitely distinctive white chest area. So there's been a lot of, as John had mentioned, these are species that are gaining a lot of attention these days, subject of much research and habitat use and requirements, population demographics, behavior, and anthropogenic threats, such as climate change, sea level rise, and so forth. If you Google Saltmarsh Sparrow, you get about 22,000 hits. I'm sure I wouldn't come anywhere near close to that if I Googled my own name. The IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the redless species, it's still globally vulnerable. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has identified it as a bird of conservation concern, and highest concern in Bird Conservation Region 30, which stretches from Maine down to Virginia. If we look at the IUCN designation of vulnerable, you can see it's due to the small and severely fragmented range of the species and the area of suitable habitat that's available, declining in most cases, and a lot of that's due to urban development. And in our own area, talk about it in a second, some of the threats to the species include loss of habitat due to filling in of marshes and so forth. The other factor being the population size of the species. About 10 years ago, there were some estimates that were generated. There were about 250,000 individuals in this range. But then there's been some more, and a closer look at those numbers, and these studies are still ongoing to ascertain and get a better estimate of the population. But that more recent estimate, in 2013, was about 30,000 individuals. Here we see an illustration of the range map, the range for the species, with the summer breeding range up here, extending from Jersey up to Maine. Then you have the permanent breeding area down here, from southern Jersey down to southern Virginia and so forth, and North Carolina, and then with the wintering population towards the southern states. Saltmarsh Sparrow is an obligate species. It occurs only on salt marshes. And here's a couple of photos from Long Island. The upper left is the Mott Lane wetlands, which abut the Wartime National Wildlife Refuge on the South Shore. And the other picture in the bottom right is a small wetland, about 20 acres. It's a DEC wetland, own wetland in Blue Point. It's a bird conservation area wetland as well. Just some points on the breeding chronology of the species. They breed from May to early August in this area. The females perform all the parental functions. The males do not do anything except breed with females. There's no pair bonding. The females are promiscuous. They'll mate with multiple males in the course of the egg-laying cycle. The nests are located in medium-height cordgrass in many cases. They will lay up 3 to 5 eggs on average. The incubation period is pretty protracted to about 11 to 12 days. All eggs hatch within 24 hours. The nestlings are attritial. They require total care by the parent, and they can fledge within 11 to 15 days. Typically, all of this breeding occurs within full moon lunar cycles, so they try to get it done before the nests are flooded out by the high tides. The species is not territorial. They have small home ranges, about 1.2 to 5.7 hectares for males and less for females. Just a schematic showing the position of the nest in the marsh. It's a nest cup, simple nest cup, woven out of dead vegetation material. It's located about 6 to 15 centimeters above the surface of the marsh. Here's a couple of pictures showing how inconspicuous the nests are in the marsh, how difficult they are to detect. So there is a nest in here, deep in the vegetation. There's a close-up of the nest with some of the vegetation pulled back. And then here's another close-up showing the scale of the nest with the pen providing a measure of scale. So the nest cup itself is only a few inches wide, somewhat deep to hold the eggs, but overall the size of the nest is very small. Next couple of photos were provided to me by the folks from the University of Connecticut, some of the work they were doing up there, and shows some of the nests, examples of nests that they are detecting up in their study area. So here's an atypical exposed nest where you can see kind of a tunnel under the salt marsh of the spartina grass leading to the nest. Here are 4 more examples showing, pointing out the labels on each where the nests are. As you can see, they're very, if you were out in a couple 100-acre marsh, you're not just going to stumble upon these nests. There's some protection that's required to locate them. 4 eggs in this picture. They can lay up to 3 to 5 eggs. As I mentioned before, incubate the eggs 11 to 12 days. They're greenish white, greenish blue, speckled with a reddish brown. Here's a photo of a nestling. So they're born blind, totally dependent on the female parent for all the nutrition. Just talk about some threats to the species. MethylMercury bioaccumulation is something that's been studied now for a few years. On effects on the species, work done in the mid-2000s, 2006. One of the first studies looking at an insectivorous passerine in a salt marsh, its bioaccumulation of MethylMercury. And then that was done in marshes, I believe, down in the Maryland, Virginia area. And we had our own study. Some people in this room participated on that. Folks from the TNC, I believe. And they sampled 3 marshes on Long Island. I believe 2 of those were TNC properties out east. And the third site was Tanner Hempstead property in the Oceanside area. And they found high concentrations of methylmercury in the blood tissue samples, which were derived from primary and tail feathers. They also also found methylmercury in invertebrate prey since increased levels of methylmercury. What are the effects of mercury contamination in sparrows and other animals for that matter? Reproductive failure, impaired muscular coordination, behavior abnormalities, normal vocalization, paralysis, and death. Another threat is nest flooding. I mentioned before that the sparrows try to synchronize their nest laying phase in between two full moon lunar cycles so that they avoid flooding. In this case, you can see the effect of whether there was a storm or that timing was off. Nests can get flooded, eggs can be floated out of the nest, nestlings can drown. So one study, or more than one study, has shown that greater than 60% of nest loss is flooded. One of the other threats is habitat loss. The upper left shows a photo from the 1960s in the Copaig area, already fairly well developed. You can see the infilling of the marsh is taking place for human development. And then, of course, that is complete down here in the lower right. So that entire habitat has been destroyed and lost for any biological activity. This was a study done by Ralph Tyner, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, recently, where he looked at aerial photos and soil and topographic maps. And they came up with some estimates that Suffolk County may have lost for the last 100 years 10,000 acres, Nassau County about 14,000 acres of tidal wetlands. So if we look at the distribution of the Saltmarsh Sparrow on Long Island, what information do we have to go by? There's not much, except some studies done by the New York State Breeding Bird Atlas program, and it shows data survey period from 1980 to 1985, and you can see here most of the Saltmarsh Sparrow detections occurred on the south shore of Long Island in those tidal marsh areas. And there were a lot of confirmed sightings based on some evidence, whether there was nest tending or some other cues that the observer had to qualify it as a confirmed breeding area. 20 years later, 2000 to 2005, you can see we have less confirmed sites, more probable sites. So there's some indication possibly that there's a shift there in Saltmarsh Sparrow activity at those sites. The only way to really conclusively address this question is to get out and search for nests and confirm breeding. So we got together with a couple of agencies on Long Island to look at this question to see if we can get out and sample some of these sites and develop a population demographic study to again, confirm nesting and then take it to the next level and determine if we could assess hatch rate, hatch success, and fledgling success. Those are all labor-intensive activities, and we went into this knowing there'd be a lot of work. And so it was a pilot study to determine how much work time, personnel effort, what the learning curve would be, and so forth. And the goal was to test the sampling protocols, evaluate the logistics, etc., and inform us on the ability to take a larger scale demographic study in the future. So we selected a few sites, mostly based on, well, there were a number of considerations: the area, the size of the marsh, the habitat that was present. It had to be suitable habitat, obviously, and then accessibility and logistic issues. So most of them were mainland sites. We had Mott Lane, we had Stillman's Creek and Blue Point, Gardner County Park and Bay Shore, Oceanside, Marine Nature Study Area in Oceanside, and then we had a site on the Barrier Island at Long Cove, our own National Seashore, and the Bay Island in Hempstead called North Cinder Island. We were borrowing protocols developed by the University of Connecticut, who had already embarked on some demographic surveys for Connecticut marshes. So what we did was we gridded these survey sites into 1 hectare area squares. We then numbered those squares, and we randomly selected a hectare plot in the suitable marsh areas. So that would be in this area here. Then we went out. The methodology was to conduct point counts, 5-minute point count surveys in the center of these hectares, and then undertake nest searches. The results of the pilot study, we were able to confirm breeding by detecting nests in these study areas at Long Cove, Mott Lane, Garters Park, Stillman Creek, and Oceanside Marine Nature Study Area. We weren't able to follow up or take the level of effort that required us to get information on the nest success and fate. In some cases, some of these sites were followed through to completion. Then came along a bigger research program based on a grant. It's called the Saltmarsh Habitat and Avian Research Program. It's a multi-state endeavor from Maine down to Virginia. The principals are University of Maine, Maine Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, University of Connecticut, University of Delaware. They established a sampling effort to look at a number of different things across this area related to salt marsh species, and with a focus on secretive salt marsh species. On the right, you can see some of the sampling sites, all of the sampling sites that they generated, that they wanted to visit on Long Island. It's quite a large number of sites. Fish and Wildlife did a handful of them. There were a number of cooperators, let's just say that went out and surveyed these sites. But these weren't, in this study, these weren't nest search sites. They were basic point count and vegetation survey efforts. So overall, what's next for us with saltmarsh sparrows on Long Island? We want to evaluate the potential to resume the demographic studies at these sites and the potential for including additional sites, again, to get a better handle on how many saltmarsh sparrows we really do have on Long Island, not just the existing data, which is to confirm whether or not they're breeding, basically. And then to integrate this project with ongoing research, such as this overall sharp study as it's known. Okay, I'm going to segue quick into red knots here. We've got about 2 minutes or so. So here to talk about the red knot. It's, hopefully most of you know or aware that it was recently proposed for listing for protection under the Endangered Species Act by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There was a notice in the Federal Register on September 30th. I believe the comment period has ended November 30th. So we proposed it as threatened. And the reasons for that were loss of breeding, non-breeding habitat, potential for disruption of natural predator cycles in the breeding grounds, reduced prey availability throughout the non-breeding range, and the increasing frequency and severity of asynchronous in the timing of the bird's annual migratory cycle relative to favorable food and weather conditions. We have some official Fish and Wildlife Service red knot listing contacts. In our regional office, we have Megan Racy in there for email. If you have any further questions on the listing process. And then Wendy Walsh down in our New Jersey field office. She's the state Fish and Wildlife office that's overseeing the listing of the red knot, obviously due to the concentrations of that species during the migratory period in the Delaware Bay region. It's a long-distance migrant, as John had mentioned in the introduction. In a year, it can travel up to 19,000 miles from its wintering grounds in Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, up to the Arctic tundra where it breeds. There are some known migratory stopover sites, but the bird can travel thousands of miles in a single flight. Here's some numbers just showing some of the trends of the species at its overwintering area and migratory stopover site, a critical one in the U.S. on the Delaware Bay region. And you can see that both trends show declining numbers. U.S., the habitat that red knot will avail itself of is bay shorelines, bay beaches, and mudflats. We're probably all aware of the link between red knots and horseshoe crab eggs as a foraging resource. And some of the threats include shoreline development, reduced food availability, disturbance, and climate change, as John had mentioned. Both of the top and the bottom photo, this were taken in West Hampton Dunes. This is the bay side of West Hampton Dunes. There's a mixed flock of shorebirds back here. There's a few red knots. There's not a lot of development along the shoreline in terms of dock structures. There's certainly a lot of houses in that area, and all that brings with it does create a source of disturbance and a source of threats to species. I'm breaking all the rules and giving a PowerPoint presentation. It shouldn't have more than 5 words per slide. So just read the highlighted. This is meant to show, historically, red knots numbered in the thousands, on thousands. And you had collectors and hunters out there who fired till their guns were dirty or their ammunition exhausted. In 1910 on Long Island, it was a well-known bird, but it was becoming uncommon. In a publication in 1910, the author was counting this time in 1895, where he saw between flocks of 1,500 or 3,000 birds in a day. Up in Massachusetts, where it's also a migrant, there were immense numbers were described as they rose up in clouds. They succumbed to a practice known as firelighting, where people would go out, one would hold a lantern, and they'd go out at dark at mid-tide. They'd apparently be able to just seize the birds and apparently bite their necks, kill them, and put them in a bag. And they would get about 10 cents a dozen. And there are accounts of barrels and barrels and barrels of birds being collected this way. So what's the distribution of red knots on Long Island? There's been some data pulled together as part of the listing process and presented here to help us provide information in the listing process and plan for its eventual protection and endangered species act. We show activity or concentrations in Jamaica Bay area, Jones Inlet area, Moriches Bay, and then further east into Shinnecock Bay area. The data spans a long time. It was based on either eBird sightings or International Shorebird Survey records back from as early as 1979. So we have some counts, 200, 350 birds, Great Kills Park in Staten Island. Jamaica Bay, high count in one survey counted about 350 birds. There were other records during that year for that site. 600 in 1988, 200 in 2007, and then out in the West Hampton, Moriches area, probably a total of about 200 on that side. Again, that's just like one count gleaned from the eBird International Shorebird Survey. So what does the future hold for us? Should the bird get listed? The final rule come through and it is listed as a threatened species. We expect to undertake consultations with other federal agencies for projects that they have on Long Island that may threaten them. After the final rule, they are going to come out and there will be a Federal Register notice proposing critical habitat designation on Long Island. So not just the species, also its habitat will be protected. Then there's the other half of a lot of what we do in Long Island, the recovery planning, and that's setting up recovery goals and objectives, and we'll probably at that point develop census techniques and so forth to move us forward and protect the birds so it eventually does get off the list. So I kind of sped through that pretty quickly, John. sure a lot of you will appreciate that. Any questions?
If the species is listed, any idea of what the level of protection would be? I'm thinking about the West Hampton area, that beach and pikes gets dog walkers, sailboarders, walkers, hikers, birders, cameramen, a whole host of things. Are they gonna think about limiting access to those beaches that support shorebirds and red dot in particular?
That could very well be, one of the recovery tools we utilize is to, limit or prohibit access to some of these critical areas like that, certainly. And then, of course, the other, as I mentioned, any federal activity, anybody who wants to try to, who applies for a permit, federal permit to construct a dock in that area, that would have to go through the whole review process.
I got a question about red dots. If the listing does go through, and maybe Byron, you could actually touch upon this when you pass the position, but what implications are there with regard to horseshoe crab harvest on Long Island throughout the range of species? And how would we interact with the Atlantic State ASMFC to ratchet that down? And I know there's been a lot of effort already done in that regard.
Right. I would expect that they would continue to review that, because it's a critical storage resource.
And that's the primary reason why the species has declined to where it is.
Right. Yeah, I would expect that they continue to coordinate to monitor those controls on parks.
Would that affect Long Island horseshoe crab harvest? I mean, mostly gets Delaware Bay.
Right. Most of the focus is in Delaware Bay. That's a good question. We could certainly bring it to the recovery team, then have them look into that further as they develop the recovery plan.
Is the Fish and Wildlife Service, I know Fish and Wildlife Service is a member of the Atlantic States Fisheries Commission. This is probably an issue that should be brought closer to their attention, the Commission's attention, in relation to the horseshoe crab harvest up and down the coast.
We'll definitely bring that to the lead, Wendy Walsh, make her informed of that.
Yeah, I would. She's in Washington or Maryland?
New Jersey.
New Jersey, okay. That's right, that close. Another thing on horseshoe crabs, because of the restrictions on the harvest of native horseshoe crabs, there's been an increase in importation of Chinese horseshoe crabs, Asian horseshoe crabs. They're all dead animals, but the problem is that they potentially bringing in attached organisms and diseases. So there's a move afoot by the department to ban the possession of Asian horseshoe crabs in New York State.
Wasn't the decline of the red knot pretty much lined up with the rise of the conch fishing industry in Cape May? And, because I mean, people were harvesting horseshoe crabs all over down the coast before that. And then all of a sudden there was this big industry. I thought that kind of tied into my mind.
Yeah. I mean, that biomedical field as well. But certainly the conch, I think American eel is that fishery too.
If the species is listed, what's the process for the recovery plan? Does that come out at the same time that the species get listed, or do you list the species and then you do a recovery plan?
Right.
Then how long will it take for the recovery plan to go forward?
I think there's a statutory requirement just that they have to do one within a certain amount of time.
Is it like
I don't know the exact.
year, 3 years?
Steve, switching to the Saltmarsh Sparrow, is there any indication that Saltmarsh Sparrow is doing worse in salt marshes that remain, or is it just a matter that the habitat has been reduced? In other words, is it, because from my perspective, looking at birds, if you go to a salt marsh, you're going to find salt marsh shells. And it's not much different from as a kid, it seems.
Right.
So I'm wondering, is there density lowered in salt marshes for that, or is it just the fact that some salt marshes are turning into marinas?
One thing that the researchers in Connecticut, Chris Elphick and his team up there have noticed based on their studies is that some of these marshes are reservoirs for non-breeding males. So you can go, they he was finding in his point counts, you can go and see all these males there, and there's no productivity on the marsh. So, and they do move around. So that's what we were trying to get at, is how productive are these marshes? Are the concentrations increasing, the densities? Are they breeding and reproducing?
Do they have a skewed sex ratio? Why are there always non-reproductive males?
Is there a surplus of them? I don't know. That's, more information we don't, needed information, at least here in Long Island.
Where on the marsh profile do they usually situate their nests?
We've seen them in pretty wet marshes. There were definitely high marsh areas in some of the Connecticut survey sites. Seeing them closer to some of the ditches and so forth in the marsh. So we didn't take any elevations.
They preferentially nest in one of the swell patches?
Yes, in the high marsh area.
So it's like Phragmites encroachment, high marsh,
Yeah, all that would be degradation of their breeding habitat.
So why aren't there any on the north shore of Long Island and the salt marshes?
Well, I think they are there.
Stony Brook.
We need to look for them. I know.
Well, that's a question. Should we be looking for them?
I think yes, and that's part of. Well, you saw the distribution from the Green Bird Atlas program. I think there's more on the South Shore based on the makeup of the wetlands. So, but I know that in the Wading River area, they've been scouting for saltmarsh sparrows there, and obviously the present.
The sources of the MethylMercury.
Point sources, the atmospheric deposition. So,
Industrial.
yeah, I mean, I think some of the sites in Oceanside were in proximity to old landfills, so there's been some leaching of that material. And the chemistry in those sediments, I guess, make it conducive to the conversion of the mercury into MethylMercury, and then its uptake by insects and spouts.
Do predators eat the eggs?
Sure.
Raccoons?
Yes, snakes, raccoons. There's been reports of northern harriers preying on saltmarsh sparrow nets. Very. Does somebody, Kurt, did you find any predators? Some of your sites?
Edible?